Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. It's another one of our All Things Africa edition. We continue to explore the history and current affairs of each African country, and we continue to explore Southern Africa, the Southern African region. And this episode, we look at the history and current affairs of Mozambique. And who better to teach us about this country or any African country than our historical guide, our tour guide, Abayomi Azikiwe of Pan African Newswire and Black Agenda Reports. Abayomi is a longtime historian, journalist, Pan Africanist, leftist activist, and just before And just before we begin, reminder to our audience, as always, to share One Plus One's content, past and present episodes, our playlists, help us overcome the far right algorithms and the dominant monopoly, Western corporate state media, and pseudo-leftist websites have in the social media world. By sharing our content, share us across social media and email. Please donate if you can to One Plus One at our PayPal. If having trouble, then get in touch with me at Youri@gmail.com. And sometimes Facebook blocks my ability to share One Plus One. So again, please share widely. Helps the show immensely, and it's our only way of overcoming colonial, pro-imperialist, sexist, heteronormative, and racist media. And folks, don't forget to help out my colleague, comrade, and friend, Chris Richards, the eclectic radical who is struggling with unemployment. Become a patron of his, because if you help Chris out, you help me out, because we want to do future journalism projects, which we need people donating to do. So, on to the topic at hand. So, Abayomi, as always, tell us, what was Mozambique like before Portuguese colonization? How did it become a Portuguese colony? And what were the conditions for the people of Mozambique when it was a Portuguese colony? And I'll just add a very quick footnote. Portugal was an absolute Catholic monarch, and then it was a fascist dictatorship. So that was a kind of European colony that the Mozambicans had to endure. So, answer, please, Abayomi.
Yes, the history of Mozambique, of course, is highly intertwined with the history of other countries in the region, as well as international forces as well, and we'll get to that later. There's evidence that 100,000 years ago, there were human settlements in the area now known as Mozambique and its surrounding areas. They found tools from that period of time. And also some of the people, the human settlements, are quite similar to those found in other parts of Southern Africa. The San people and also the Khoisan are the earliest documented human groupings that are to be found in the Mozambique area. Of course, Mozambique is a very rich country in terms of its resources and also the clear waterways that are surrounding the islands of Mozambique, as well as the coast of Mozambique on the Indian Ocean. The country had developed kingdoms. They had developed trading networks, not only in Africa, but also along the Indian Ocean, extending all the way up to the Arabian Peninsula, including Oman, Yemen, and other states. And of course, it was tied in later with the Kingdom of Zimbabwe. The Kingdom of Zimbabwe was not just confined to what the geographic boundaries of Zimbabwe are today, or became after the colonial onslaught of the late 19th century. It was much broader, and some of the peoples of Mozambique were there as well. You also had the intervention of Islam, particularly along the coast in Mozambique. Muslim scholars and traders came there as early as the 7th century AD. But even prior to that, there were settlements that made contact with people from as far away as Persia, the Arab states, which this was before the rise of Islam as a religion and as a way of life. So it has a very deep and long, protracted history. And of course, with the introduction of Islam, there was the rise of literature and various other cultural forms of expression. Also, the trade that Mozambique, the traditional and indigenous people of Mozambique were involved in, included gold, diamonds, ivory, and also various spices and other forms of food. They have evidence that all different types of breads, flours, porridges, and other forms of food were consumed by the indigenous people, even including palm wine, which is usually associated with countries in West Africa. There's evidence that this was prevalent as well. The Portuguese arrived in the late 15th century, around 1498. A man by the name of Vasco da Gama. A lot of people have heard of him. He has a notorious reputation as an explorer, as a plunderer, and an enslaver. And this is what happened. This is his record in Portugal as well. First, when they came, they said they just wanted to set up trading forts. They wanted to cooperate with the existing Islamic and Arab, Persian, and African population groups that were there. But the civilizations that developed in East Africa along the Indian Ocean were very strong and very viable. From you talking about the first century of the Christian era, going all the way up until the time of the intervention of the Portuguese. So it was viable trade that was going on, commercial activity that took place in that area. So you had a very vibrant culture and civilization which existed. And as I mentioned, they were tied in with people further south, all the way into Tanzania, people into the interior of Africa, as far north and west as the Democratic Republic of Congo, south into the Zambezi Valley area, and even extending as far into South Africa. So yes, it was by no means an isolated situation. So you had other peoples that came in. You had the San, the Khoisan. Then there were other people who are conveniently described as the Bantu. They came in from the further north and west, and they intermingled with the indigenous people there, and other civilizations arose during that period. So that's pretty much what it was like prior to the coming of the Portuguese in 1498. When the Portuguese came in, things changed dramatically in the whole East Africa region, because although initially they said they were just there for the purposes of trade, eventually they wound up taking over the trading routes. They disrupted the cooperation that existed between the various groups there. And of course, eventually they instituted the Atlantic slave trade, which was extremely vicious, much more vicious than the East African slave trade, which channeled people largely to the Arabian Peninsula during that particular time period.
And tell us a bit more about what were the conditions like for the people of Mozambique when Portugal colonized it. And Portugal was a feudal, absolute Catholic monarch, and then later it became a fascist dictatorship with, of course, Portuguese characteristics.
Yes, and it was very bad for the African people under the domination of the Portuguese. They destroyed a lot of the traditional trading networks, economic cooperation that existed between various peoples in East Africa and Southern Africa, extending up the Indian Ocean to the Arabian Peninsula and even beyond into Persia and as far away as China. In fact, prior to the end of the 15th century, the center of the world economic system was in the Indian Ocean basin. And it appears today to be going back in that direction. Western Europe was still heavily underdeveloped. They had collapsed after the collapse of the Greek and the Roman civilizations and the ascendancy of the Ottoman Empire. All of that had an impact as well on the decline of African civilizations in Southern as well as East Africa. So it had a very, very negative impact. Eventually, the slave trade became dominant. A lot of the Africans were shipped out to areas as far away as Brazil and also in Europe itself. So Brazil became a center of the Atlantic slave trade. That's why today, even, you have the largest concentration of people of African descent outside of Africa reside in Brazil. There are even more Africans in Brazil than there are in the United States.
Yeah.
And the Caribbean. So this is a very, very interesting point to make. Yet, Portugal wound up essentially being on the bottom of the European imperialist construct. They were beholden to the British, the French, and to a lesser extent, the Germans, because the Germans, of course, lost during World War I. They had to relinquish their colonies in Africa. But the British were strengthened, and to a certain extent, the French were as well. So by the time of the Berlin Conference, they had to negotiate with the British and the French and the other European colonial powers to set the boundaries for Mozambique and other countries in the region. As I said before, these countries were not divided prior to the advent of the Atlantic slave trade and the rise of classical colonialism in Africa. Now, during the 1800s, of course, the British were claiming that they were trying to stop or curtail the Atlantic slave trade. But all they wanted to do was to set up a more efficient form of labor exploitation and repression. So they made some agreements with the Portuguese to curtail the Atlantic slave trade, but it still went on clandestinely all the way up until the 20th century. So you had forced labor, you had the driving people away from their traditional lands, the disruption of commerce and trading networks that existed in Africa, the Indian Ocean basin, all the way to West Asia. So this was the impact of the Portuguese involvement in Africa. And they were extremely vicious. Between the 15th and the 17th century, they pretty much eliminated the traditional trading networks and civilizations which existed in East and Southern Africa during that time period. So in the 19th century, the 1860s to the 1880s, in South Africa, for example, they discovered diamonds and gold. So this brought about the demand for cheap African labor. So Mozambique, Malawi, Zimbabwe were forced to send their people to work in the mines in South Africa. So this was another major drain on the Mozambican society and the economy as well. So that just gives you an idea of what happened during the period. They went from being a center of international commerce for its diversity in terms of civilizations to becoming more or less a vassal of Portuguese colonialism and imperialism with the forced labor and also being forced to pay taxes as well, high taxes, just for being a person who lives on this earth. So this was the modus operandi that existed all across the African continent. We talked about Tanganyika earlier. They had to pay the hut taxes. The Germans, of course, forced them off their land and also to pay taxes and to participate in forced labor. So all of these traditional societies, the ones that did not acquiesce to the Europeans or were forced into compulsive labor, still revolted. There were still rebellions that took place in Mozambique and in other countries throughout the region against the repressive and exploitative conditions that people were forced to live under, all the way up to the 20th century.
Talk now briefly about when Mozambique became independent. Was it one of violent struggle or a peaceful transition of power?
Well, the system was so exploitative and so repressive that it required greater administrative support from Europe. So the Portuguese, beginning in the 20th century began to send more and more of its citizens to Mozambique and other colonies in Africa, particularly Mozambique. There were hundreds of thousands of Portuguese who were there, even at the time of independence in 1975. So, after World War One, an attempt to have some type of bourgeois democratic system in Portugal failed. So there was the evolution of a so-called new state, which began in the 1920s. That was highly unstable. And then by the late 1920s, they became an outright fascist dictatorship. But they were sending a lot of their people to Mozambique to work in the repressive apparatus of the state as administrators, as managers of the corporations that were set up. You had the Mozambique Company, and there were other companies that were set up to manage the theft of resources and also the labor, the exploitative labor of African people in that region. So, yes, it was a very bad oppressive system. So, during the 1950s, a lot of people were imprisoned. They were driven into exile. So people started discussing, methods for fighting colonial domination. So in the 1950s, the antecedents of what became known as the Mozambique Liberation Front began to develop. By 1962, in Tanzania, which was gained its independence the year before, the Mozambique Liberation Front was formed led by a man named Eduardo Malande. And Eduardo Malande was a very educated, very militant person who even went to school here in the United States at Syracuse University. But he was one of the co-founders of the Mozambique Liberation Front Frelimo. And in 62, they started out demanding independence from Portugal. That didn't work because the Portuguese had no interest in any type of negotiated transitional process. Just like in Guinea-Bissau, remember we talked about in Guinea-Bissau how they massacred the dock workers there in 1959, which led to a transition towards an armed struggle. A similar situation developed in Mozambique. The repressive apparatus of the state was so uncompromising that in 1964, in the northern part of the country, they began to wage armed struggle. And a lot of the arms that they received came from other independent African states, as well as China, and to a lesser degree, the Soviet Union. So this was in 1964. They began fighting and making gains there. But in 1969, Eduardo Malande was assassinated. And after his assassination, a man named Samora Machel took over Frelimo. And he became a very dominant force in the Mozambique liberation movement after 1969.
Perfect. In fact, and that's a great segue to talk about. That's a great segue to talk about him. What was that phrase that he said? La luta continua.
Yeah. La luta continua. Yeah, the struggle continues in Portuguese.
Exactly. So as you mentioned, there was quite a ferocious guerrilla war, quite a long armed struggle for independence that the Portuguese colonies waged on the colonialists. Now, talk to us about the first president of Mozambique, Samora Machel. You already talked a little bit about his party, Frelimo, and he served as president from June 15, 1975, until he died in a plane crash October 19th, 1980, which many believe he was murdered, that this wasn't some crazy act of God, that he was in fact murdered by South Africa, apartheid South Africa. And now, how do you assess his legacy socioeconomic wise for the vast majority of poor Mozambicans? And before you answer, let me just say the following. Mozambique, like Angola, was a huge flashpoint during the Cold War where it got really hot, the wars. By 1977, the country was gripped into a civil war. Reading about Frelimo is fascinating on Wikipedia, as they are members of of Socialist International, where the global center left and some of the far left gathered to meet to see how they can help one another out and advance a global left-leaning world. The problem with SI and its sister Democratic and sister organization Progressive Alliance is much of the Western European social democratic parties and the Nordic ones and states like Australia's Labour Party and so forth have pivoted largely to the right against their domestic populists and always were supportive of social imperialism and hostile towards the global South's more far left or just common anti-colonial left. On Wikipedia, Frelimo, they were described as being far left during the remaining chapters of the Cold War, being machoism, communist, Marxist, Leninist. So it's interesting that they are a member of that organization. Nowadays, the ideology is democratic socialism, African nationalism, Pan-Africanism, leftism, left nationalism, social patriotism, and they were members of the African left nationalist movements, liberation movements of Southern Africa. And they currently are members of the Russian anti-imperialist movement, but it leads more towards the right for the freedom of nations. Frelimo, and while Wikipedia describes them now as democratic socialists, in the early years, they were communist and even influenced by Marxism-Leninism. And the civil war was between them and the Western-backed South African Rhodesian proxy far-right armed group Renamo, the Mozambique National Resistance, which I'll give more information about them later. But first, Abayomi, tell us about the legacy of Samora Machel and Frelimo and the party under his and the country under his socioeconomic legacy and even foreign policy, if you want.
Yes. Well, as I mentioned, the conditions under colonialism were extremely harsh. The forced labor was a major aspect of that. And the choices that people were given were very limited. For example, forced labor on the plantations that developed sisal and other products, sugar. Also, the rail lines which were built by the Portuguese were all designed to funnel labor into the plantations as well into the strategic mines in South Africa, the gold mines, the diamond mines, etc. So yes, that was fertile ground for revolutionary recruitment and organization during the 1960s in Mozambique. And of course, the Portuguese did not invest hardly anything inside the country. So it was a very limited skilled and educated personnel among the African people. Samora Machel did train as a paramedic, as a nurse, which helped the Frelimo party in terms of its outreach around the area in which they had liberated during the 1960s and early 1970s. In terms of ideological orientation, a lot of the liberation movements were based, they had rear bases. For example, Frelimo was based heavily in Tanzania, which gained its independence in 1971. When Mozambique gained its independence in 1975, both the Zimbabwe African National Union and the Zimbabwe African People's Union, ZAPU and ZANU, which were the leading liberation movements, had bases in Mozambique, which made them a target of both the settler colonial Rhodesian government as well as the apartheid settler colonial regime in South Africa. So Marxism, Leninism was adopted by the liberation movement even before they became an independent state. Then after 1975, they switched and became a Marxist-Leninist one-party state by 1977. This came out of some of their early congresses. Before that, there was an alliance called the Congress of Nationalist Movements in the Portuguese Colonies, CONCEPT, which encompassed Frelimo, the PAIGC out of Guinea-Bissau, and the MPLA in Angola. Now, groups that fell outside of that, for example, UNITA, the FNLA, and Fling in Guinea-Bissau were not included in CONCEPT because they were considered the left-wing, socialist-oriented, Marxist-oriented parties or national liberation movements seeking to become political parties. Mm-hmm. So they didn't accept Marxism as an ideological basis for their organization. They tried to modernize the population in Mozambique during the liberation struggle by introducing modern healthcare, vaccinations, which we were talking about before the program started. So these are things that the liberation movements incorporated, as modernization efforts during the liberation struggle. So yes, that was a very, very important aspect of it. So I did want to mention that in the 1920s and 1930s, Portugal became a fascist, authoritarian, corporate state, and they considered all their colonies in Africa as overseas Portuguese territories. So they didn't recognize any legitimacy in regard to independence for their colonies in Africa. They referred to them as overseas Portuguese territories. This was under Catano, as well as later under Salazar. Nonetheless, people in the military, particularly the rank and file and lower ranking officer corps, were fed up with these wars that were taking place in the Portuguese colonies in Africa. They also controlled the Azores Islands, yes, which were utilized as military bases for carrying out the war against the liberation movements in Africa. The U.S. also utilized the Azores during the Vietnam War as refueling stations and for storing equipment when they were fighting against the Vietnamese, which they lost along with the Portuguese, who lost their colonies in Africa as well. So in 1974, I believe it was April 25th, the officers staged a coup, the lower ranking officers. And one of the first policy decisions they made was to relinquish Portuguese control of their colonies in Africa and other parts of the world. So when that happened, of course, this set the stage for a rebellion inside of Portugal itself, a left-wing rebellion which took place in 1975, but it was not successful in terms of setting up a Marxist-Leninist state in Portugal, to the pleasure of the United States, because the United States was in deep crisis in 1975. They lost their outpost in Vietnam, in Cambodia, and Laos. And also that year, there was a huge economic recession, which prompted the reconfiguration of the world imperialist system after 1975. People like Emmanuel Wallerstein from the State University of New York, documented this in their research. But even if they didn't document it, this was the reality. You have problems in the urban areas and the cities, for example. A lot of the industries began to restructure. Otto laid off, considerable numbers of people during that time period. You had the continued flight out of cities, municipalities like Detroit and others, Cleveland, Ohio, and other areas, with the breakup of the steel industry and the export of production of steel to other areas around the world, particularly in the so-called global South. So this happened in 1975, when the country was declared independent in June of 1975. A lot of the Portuguese settlers fled the country because they didn't want to live under Frelimo. They considered it first they were Africans, and then on top of that, they were Marxists and socialists. They had no interest, so they fled. A lot of them went to South Africa and other parts of the world. And there's a huge Portuguese community in South Africa. They're still there. So yes, a lot of them left. But when they left, just like in Guinea-Conakry during the late 1950s, they took a lot of their resources with them. The equipment to run plants, technological apparatus to conduct an industrial society. So as Samora Machel said, it wasn't that they chose nationalization as the first option. They had no choice except to nationalize industry, because the people who were running the industries there fled the country. So this is what happened. And in 1977, Mozambique and Angola both became Marxist-Leninist one-party states. Of course, this did not go well with the United States and the continuing settler colonial regimes in Rhodesia and South Africa and Southwest Africa, which later became Namibia. And of course, Northern Rhodesia, became no northern Rhodesia became Zambia, but southern Rhodesia became Zimbabwe
Yeah.
after 1980. So yeah, all these liberation movements, the ones that were progressive, that were left-leaning, had alliances. And this is very, very important to understand the whole history of the region. So Rhodesia initially funded and armed the Mozambique National Resistance as early as the late 1970s when they started out. And all they did was go around and destroy all the development projects that Frelimo were working on, terrorizing the population, and trying to set up a similar system of forced labor, which was in existence prior to independence. After 1975, when Frelimo took power, they abolished the forced labor system, although they did continue to send people to work in South Africa. But they reduced the number of people who they were sending to work in South Africa. So this is what happened then. So with the funding of Renamo by the Rhodesian government under Ian Smith, this set back the development efforts of Frelimo in Mozambique. In 1980, the settler colonial regime of Rhodesia collapsed because of the fierce opposition from ZANU PF and ZAPU PF. The country became independent in April of 1980. So Renamo had to find another sponsor. So the apartheid regime under the Nationalist Party began to fund them and train them. So they caused a lot of damage inside the country. By the early 1980s, there were a lot of serious security problems in Mozambique. And they had housed, for example, the African National Congress. Their military wing, Umkhonto we Sizwe, was housed there, and a lot of their operations were being run out of Mozambique. And of course, the apartheid regime knew this, so that's why they were funding the MNR. They were also engaged in periodic bombing operations in Mozambique as well. The Rhodesians did this, the Air Force, even during the liberation struggles in Zimbabwe. I remember in 1977, 1978, they were bombing Mozambique to kill people that were living in the refugee camps in Mozambique who were allied with the ZANU PF liberation movement, killing hundreds, if not thousands, of people at one time.
And this is so when does the I believe if I read my Wikipedia right, so the Civil War starts in 1977. So that's 3 years after Mozambique becomes independent. They win their independence through armed struggle and so forth. Yeah. Just talk to us a bit more about the Mozambique Civil War. You're already telling us how bloody and gruesome it was, this Cold War, hot war, and I think important facts that you already have talked about and that you're already acknowledging is how did it end, the legacy of it, and safe to say that that it weakened the socialist project Frelimo was trying to build. Because this was a 16-year-long civil war, which basically was an act of sabotage on the part of the capitalist imperialist West, correct?
Exactly. I wouldn't even phrase it as a civil war. It was mainly a sabotage campaign that was funded largely by the former settler colonial regime of Rhodesia, and then later by the apartheid settler colonial regime in the Republic of South Africa. But it really picked up steam after the independence of Zimbabwe in 1980, because the white settler colonialists felt that they were being closed in on, that it was just a matter of time before they would be overrun, by these African liberation movements, who they feared as being socialists, Marxist, Leninists, and communists. This was their propaganda. They were fighting communism, and the United States went along with that. Even though there were compromises that were made by ZANU PF and ZAPU PF as early as 1980. For example, they set up coalition government, the first government in 1980 that lasted for 5 years. They didn't become a republic until 1985. This is in Zimbabwe. Then you had the merger in 1987, early 1988, of ZANU-ZAPU into one political party. In the initial years, there were problems between the two organizations. Even Joshua Nkomo, who was the leader of ZAPU, had to flee the country for a period of time. But these issues were resolved by the end of the 1980s, and they merged as a political party, ZANU and ZAPU. It just became ZANU PF by late 1987. But they continued to fund the MNR, the so-called Mozambique National Resistance, all through the 1980s, even after Zimbabwe gained its independence. The situation got so bad that around 1984, 1985, the Zimbabwe Defense Forces sent troops along what they call the Bara Corridor, which would protect rail lines coming from the Indian Ocean all the way into the interior of Mozambique. So they sent like perhaps 10,000, if not more, troops from Zimbabwe to defend the people of Mozambique during the 1980s. So this is what was going on. It got so bad that in 1984, the Mozambique government under Frelimo was forced to sign an agreement, a mutual non-aggression pact with the racist regime in South Africa called the Nkomati Accord.
Wow.
That was in the spring of 1984 when that was signed. And people saw this as a tremendous defeat of the liberation movement, particularly the ANC in South Africa. But what happened, interestingly enough, that same year was that the struggle inside of South Africa took off. The year before, you had the development of the United Democratic Front, which was founded in 1983. Then in 1984, you had widespread mass struggles that developed in South Africa against the so-called councils that ran, who were really collaborators with the apartheid regime. And then the armed struggle escalated too as well inside the country after 1980. But you had the whole generation after 1976, the student uprisings and the worker uprisings of 1976 and 1977. People who were forced out of the country, who fled the country, went to refugee camps in the surrounding areas and joined the ANC, the PAC, and there was even efforts by the Black Consciousness movement as well to organize armed guerrilla groups during the late 1970s and early 1980s. But inside the country itself, you had a huge upsurge in 1983, 84, 85 of the student movement, the workers' movement, and the movements in the communities. The Congress of South African Trade Unions, for example, was formed in late 1985. It had over 1 million members. And they said they were allied with the ANC. So this is what was going on. So they felt very, very threatened. Mozambique was under extreme attack during this period. So Samora Machel was on a plane coming from a meeting of the Southern African Development Coordinating Conference, which was a precursor to the Southern African Development Community. And his plane went down ostensibly in a crash. But it was, of course, theorized that the apartheid regime, military forces, air forces, brought the plane down, killing Samora Machel. It was a tremendous blow in October of 1986, his death. And in Zimbabwe, people were extremely upset, and they went out and started attacking, anybody that had any relationship with the white settler minority who would not pledge allegiance to Africa and to Frelimo in Mozambique and ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe. So he dies in 1986 in this horrendous crash. And of course, after that, another president was appointed to take over.
Before we get there, let me also just add another important thing. Important to add this for our viewers and listeners. The group that tried to topple Frelimo, Renamo, they are still an active political party in
Right.
Mozambique, shockingly enough. And they
Mhm.
were a proxy of the existing Southern Rhodesia and then later apartheid, South Africa, basically being a proxy of the West, the US, Canada, Britain, and their allies. And their positions nowadays are center right, but it's all far right to me. And their
Mhm.
ideology is Mozambican nationalism, conservatism, economic liberalism, and anti communism. And they are members of the centrist Democrats International as an observer member. This is where the global Christian Democrats, who are right leaning, and in Latin America, they're very much far right, and much of the global south, they are part of the far right. And they're also members of the African branch of the International Democracy Union. They're members of the Democrat Union of Africa, the IDU, as I remind our audience. Their chairperson is Stephen Harper of the Conservative Party of Canada, former prime minister. And this is where the global right wing meet to see how they can advance a global right wing agenda, how they can help one another out. And the DUA is essentially where the African far right and whatnot meet to see how they can help one another out in Africa and make sure that Africa is beholden to neocolonialism and that their elites get a seat at the table and slice of the pie, very, very disgusting.
Yeah.
And I'll also add one thing, because this is also quite shocking. I didn't realize this, but when Samora Michelle was murdered, another person who was murdered, I believe, a couple of years earlier, 1980, was Olaf Palme. Now, Olaf Palme, although unfortunately he was not a friend to the indigenous Sami people of Sweden, but he was one of the last I would say radical social democrats, if they even existed. Certainly, certainly in the Nordic context. And he was a very good friend to South Africa. He believed in détente with Cuba. And towards the end of his life, he was actually becoming more and more radical. And he was starting to think, Socialist International, maybe we should actually allow the USSR as members. Maybe we should actually, ally with the communists.
Yeah. I
And so
remember
forth.
Olaf Palme. Yeah.
And it's very and he was an outspoken critic of the Vietnam War, and it's just very interesting how he was mysteriously murdered first by somebody who they said was a mentally ill person, but all of the conspiracy theories, I believe them that it was NATO, because he was an opponent of NATO as well, and Sweden ever joining NATO. And I think South Africa, Israel, apartheid South Africa, the West, through NATO, maybe it was Operation Gladio or whatever, I believe was very much involved in Olaf Palme's murder. The official Swedish truth was that it was this lone gunman who had mental illness, but now Sweden, several years later, says, we don't know.
Yeah.
Make what you will with that. So
Yeah. The typical Lee Harvey Oswald scenario. The
I
lone
know,
gunman, the
unbelievable.
confused, mentally ill, violent person. But yeah, I remember Olaf Palme when he was assassinated. And during that time, in the mid 1980s, there was a big struggle going on in the UK and Western Europe over the placing of medium range nuclear missiles in Europe. And you had this huge occupation of areas in the UK. And this was being covered heavily by the former Soviet press, Radio Moscow. I used to listen to them every day. And they talked about the assassination of Olaf Palme and that it was some type of conspiracy on the part of imperialism to take him out because he opposed the further imperialist militarization of Western Europe. Yeah, so it's very, very interesting that this took place during this particular time period. But yes, the Scandinavian countries, particularly Sweden, was doing a lot of material assistance work to people in Southern Africa during that time period. There was a university at Uppsala in Sweden. They
Yeah,
used to do a lot of publications of people who are doing research on Southern Africa. I used to correspond with them when I was working at the universities in the 1980s and 1990s, in fact. So they would give a lot of aid to the liberation movements, and even Namibia, South Africa, as well as Mozambique and Angola. So
And now it's just amazing how even the Nordic countries, how much
to
to
the
the
right,
rights
yeah.
that they've all
Well, we'll
shifted,
see.
even on foreign, like even on well, I mean, I'll give the Nordic countries credit where credit is due. Big mobilizations against the Iraq War, not so much against Afghanistan, unfortunately, but also it's where some of the most vibrant Palestine action stuff happens. I mean, the song Live Palestina, Krusha Zionism is from a Swedish group, a Swedish Palestinian group, and so forth.
Amazing.
That's but unfortunately, yeah, a lot of the social democratic parties of Sweden, Denmark, and so forth. On the domestic front, they've pivoted a lot to neoliberalism,
Mm.
and then on foreign policy, just more and more aggressive in NATOism and so forth. So all
Well,
that,
a lot of that
yeah,
probably has to do with the migration of
one of
African
the reasons, one
people,
of many reasons.
Arabs, and others into those countries. And I remember, maybe a decade and a half ago, they even had a rebellion in Sweden on the part of, blacks and other people of color because of racism and discrimination and so forth that was taking place, which was shocking to a lot of people in the United States because these countries were considered, more liberal and tolerant. And, I knew people who were older people who were in the US military during the 60s who, rather than come back to the States after they were discharged, went to live in these Nordic and Scandinavian countries in Europe. And they
So
said it was
that's
very good at the time. But even musicians like Dexter Gordon and others wound up spending time there. During the 60s.
That's very interesting in and of itself
Mhm.
because I was also saying at the top of my mentioning Olaf Palme, although he
Yeah,
was a great friend to he was a great friend to South Africa. Uh, Also, the beginning of Palestine solidarity, standing up for the PLO and so forth, but when it comes to the Sami people, the indigenous Sami people, that's where all that Swedish Nordic tolerant stuff goes completely
liberalism,
out the window. And
I know.
Denmark, I can tell you, all of their tolerance and so forth when it comes to the indigenous Greenlanders and some of their
Yeah,
own sort of Sami expat communities. Oh my gosh, it's grotesquely, white supremacist, racist, settler colonialist. I mean, all of Europe, I mean, the discrimination against the Roma traveler people and so forth. And then just, the old fashioned xenophobia, any, Turkish immigrants, Arab immigrants,
yeah,
African immigrants will, will experience, will experience, white supremacy, but always with a
yes.
French or a German, Italian
Mhm.
spin to it. But getting back to Mozambique,
Yeah, let's get back to Southern Africa. Yeah, but
Uh, so so
your
you
point is,
so you were talking about the rise of the president who came after Samora Machel. So what is your assessment of Joaquim Chissano, also part of Frelimo, elected November the 6th, 1986 to December 1st, 1990, and again from December 1st, 1990 to February 2nd, 2005. The Civil War ends sometime, I believe, in 92. How do you assess his legacy in terms of socioeconomics, social mobility, and even his foreign policy?
well, there was a shift to the center in Mozambique after the devastation that was brought about as a result of Renamo and the internal disruptions by first the settler colonial regime in Rhodesia and later in the so-called Republic of South Africa under the Boers, that they were forced. Well, first of all, Portugal was a very weak and probably at the bottom of the imperialist heap as far as Europe is concerned. They didn't have a lot to invest in their colonies. in Africa. And Samora Machel described them as the most backward country in Europe. That's how he described them in Mozambique
Oh
when
yeah.
he went there in the 1980s. I have a copy of a speech that he made. So by 1983, 84, even Samora Machel made a trip to Western Europe, where he was trying to reorient their economic policy to a more liberalized system to encourage foreign investment in Mozambique. It really didn't work very well in the first few years, but that was their position. They moved away formally from claiming that they were a Marxist-Leninist one-party state, and then moved more towards a centrist type position. But that still wasn't enough for the imperialists and the settler colonialists. They continued to fund these terrorist groups that were disrupting Mozambique, because the potential for Mozambique is vast. In recent years, and we'll talk about this later, huge resources, deposits of natural gas have been discovered, particularly in the northern Cabo Delgado region. So after the death of Samora Machel, Joaquim Chissano took over, and of course, they moved in a more moderate framework, but still they believed in national unity, they believed in regional unity and Pan-Africanism as well. So they had to try to rein in the MNR, and with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the countries in Eastern Europe, I think the appetite on the part of the Western imperialist countries, and of course they had already lost Southern Rhodesia, which became Zimbabwe. Even the Boers themselves were weakened heavily due to the internal mass and armed struggle and labor struggles that took place from the mid 1980s all the way up to the early 1990s, which forced, the release of political prisoners beginning in the late 80s, and then after 1990, they had to release Mandela and the other top leaders of the ANC and the PAC and the South African Communist Party. But yes, support for them weakened, and they were able to reach some type of agreement in 1992 to somehow become a legitimate political party, that is the MNR. But there's been flare-ups since then. There have been outbreaks of conflict led by Alfonso Blacama, who was the leader of the MNR during that particular critical period. But they did eventually liberalize the state, set up multi-party democratic systems. But the MNR has not been able to take power in Mozambique, even though they are a legitimate, quote, legitimate political party inside the country. And they've undergone splits themselves. So there are other splinter groups now that have surfaced who were former MNR members. So in 1990, of course, the Boers were forced to relinquish control of Southwest Africa, which was Namibia.
Yes.
The Southwest Africa People's Organization, which was the leading vanguard liberation movement in Namibia, which was allied with the African National Congress, and the MPLA, a Workers' Party of Angola, triumphed at Quito, Carnival, and the other battles that were fought in southern Angola in 1988. And of course, the Cubans left the country starting in 1989, and Namibia became independent in 1990. So this further weakened the ability of the apartheid regime to keep funding the MNR. So they did work out some type of ceasefire in 1992. The MNR became a political party, and they began to contest the elections, I believe, starting in 1994.
And yet it was under Frelimo where capitalism reigns supreme. So I have to, perfect segue to this question then, which is Arnaldo Guiboza of Frelimo, president from the 2nd of February 2005 to January 15, 2015. Yeah, how do you assess his legacy in terms of socioeconomic, social mobility, and foreign policy?
Yeah, they opened up the country for foreign investment, which a lot of it occurred. A lot more development in terms of businesses, loans being extended from international financial institutions, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. They joined during the early 1990s. So you had this whole liberalization process, which took place inside the country, which improved the conditions, at least in the short term, of a lot of people inside of Mozambique, even though there's still considerable poverty that exists. So yes, there was a liberalization, but Frelimo still maintained its alliances across the region. And prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Comecon countries, the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, they were a part of that whole economic and political network, along with Angola, Ethiopia under the Workers' Party, and prior to that, the DERG, the PMAC. They were part of that whole socialist-oriented economic network that was established. Of course, that fell apart when the countries in Eastern Europe collapsed.
Yeah.
We're talking about the German Democratic Republic, Poland, Czechoslovakia, eventually Romania, I believe, was the last one. Yugoslavia as well, which was not a part of that. They had broken with under Stalin. They had broken with the Soviet Union, but then they repaired relations with the Soviet Union after Stalin's death under Khrushchev. In 1991, that collapsed with the outbreak of civil war in Yugoslavia, the Federal Republic, Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia, which failed. So all of these developments had an impact on the socialist countries in the so-called global South, as we call it now. Even Cuba went through a special period.
Yeah.
In the early 1990s, where the Soviets cut off aid to Cuba. They would supply tremendous amounts of sugar to the Soviet Union at a standard price above the market rate. And in exchange, they had other programs between the Soviet Union and Cuba. That
Poor
collapsed.
Mozambique.
That collapsed. So a lot of the countries had moved away, from socialist-oriented planning. Cuba, Fidel Castro gave that famous speech in 1990, Socialism or Death. But even Cuba itself began to move towards bringing in more tourists and setting up small-scale individual business enterprises. And I think it helped them a lot to stave off total economic collapse, which they were facing during the early 1990s. Lack of food, lack of energy resources. So yes, and that has resurfaced, of course, under Donald Trump, who has a complete, blockade. Cuba was already under a blockade. It has been since 1960, but now it's gotten even worse. Total fuel blockade, and it was only Russia that was able to break through recently to bring 100,000 tons of fuel into Cuba. But that's still not enough. Mexico has also been providing petroleum resources as well.
Yeah, we
So the
wonder what's
countries in
gonna
Africa,
curious what's gonna happen if China's going to break that American blockade on the Strait of Hormuz. But that's another topic for another
yeah.
day.
Well,
But then I
China
have to
too
ask
has
you.
been supplying solar panels to Cuba, which will help considerably.
Oh
Yeah.
wow.
So all these countries in the global South during the 1990s, many of them moved more towards the center. And with the rise of the demand for multi-party elections, which we talked about earlier, like what happened in Zambia in 1991, how the party there was voted out of office in 1991 by this so-called mass democratic movement, which was not mass or democratic either. It went even further to the right and became even more corrupt than any of the corruption you could find in the government of Kenneth Kaunda. So this is what happened.
Yeah,
And
it's also funny. I have to mention this, but it's funny how we look back in the '90s. Bill
yeah,
Clinton was considered the MTV president, and
America's first black president
yeah, some even would
from
say he was the
Arkansas.
first gay president, but he was hostile to both communities. Funnily enough, it's funny.
Exactly.
It's funny how we look back in the '90s as this sort of better period than like the dark ages of the 1980s. There was grunge music. There was a golden age of like metal. There was the golden age of like R&B music and like rap and gangster rap and so forth, and all this diversity in the hip hop community. Oh, but my gosh, when you actually look back in the '90s, it was actually a really, really awful period. And we don't call it austerity, but it really was just ongoing austerity, maybe neo austerity and so forth.
Hmm. Yeah.
I mean the austerity program of Clinton's was even more vicious than anything Reagan or George
Hmm.
H.W. Bush did. Tony Blair was an even more violent, prime minister than Margaret Thatcher ever was. And then in Canada, talk about dark ages, but the austerity of the Paul Martin, Jean Chrétien, austerity bill was just vicious, more vicious than anything Brian Mulroney, could ever dream of. And then Eastern Europe was the beginning of what my friend Boyan often describes as a civilizational downgrade for the Eastern European countries with the reintroduction of capitalism. People call it
Yes.
liberal democracy. I call it libertarian democracy. So the '90s was an awful period. And even South Africa, end of apartheid, only racial apartheid, but economic apartheid remains the same. So when we talk about,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Even in Namibia, I went there in 1992, and they had been independent. They had gotten their independence, and I was staying with the SWAPO people. I'd known them here in the States, around the universities and so forth, and they were quite apologetic, saying that, well, we have our independence, but we don't control the economy. They were very honest about it, but it was still a nice country. It was much better atmosphere than
oh
having
yeah, no, it's
those
crazy.
soldiers.
So
Yeah.
so so
Hmm.
so so it's crazy that Mozambique experiences just nothing but economic sabotage and terrorism from from the Western proxies of first Southern Rhodesia and then later South
Hmm.
Africa. So Mozambique then embraces austerity and so forth. So talk to us then about the legacy of of Filipe Nossi, who becomes president. And again, he is a member of Frelimo from the 15th of January 2015 to the 15th of January 2025. How do you assess his legacy in terms of socioeconomics and social mobility?
Yeah, he continued the same process of economic liberalization, um, introducing more foreign investment. There was the project in Cabo Delgado, the natural gas project that's being carried out with ExxonMobil, where they want to exploit the natural gas resources, transform it to liquefied natural gas. Unfortunately, what happened in the area was that another rebel group surfaced, violent rebel group calling itself Al Shabaab, and they actually disrupted the
But nothing to do with the Al Shabaab in
no,
Somalia, right?
no, so they say, but it's a Islamist rebel group, probably funded, in my opinion, by the West or Saudi Arabia, some of the Persian Gulf Arab monarchies, because they would view uh, natural gas production, liquefied natural gas transitional production, as a threat to their domination of the petroleum and natural gas industry in West Asia. So a lot of people were killed, they were displaced. So what happened was that the Southern African Development Community sent in its military forces to help the Mozambique government and the National Army to fight these rebels. Uh, things were still very difficult. Then the Rwandan Patriotic Front, the government that controls Rwanda, agreed to send in its troops into northern Mozambique to help out as well. And they were able to beat back these rebels and to resume production in this process. But it's still a very delicate and somewhat precarious security situation in Cabo Delgado, particularly surrounding natural gas exploitation and liquefied natural gas production. But all along the East African coast, there have been discoveries of huge deposits of natural gas and oil. And a lot of it is offshore. You know, Uganda, Mozambique, and Tanzania, all, you know, have been discovered as being huge deposits of natural gas and oil. So this is going to be problematic for these countries because the imperialists, their objective is to prevent any of these so-called middle-income countries and developing countries from consolidating their economic and socioeconomic positions on a global scale. And that's the problem they have with Iran. You know, this is the problem they had with Syria and other countries that are trying to develop themselves. The BRICS countries. You know, BRICS is not a socialist construct. You know, it's composed of people with different social systems, but they are committed to de-dollarization and they are committed to multilateralism as opposed to the United States unilateralism because the United States wants to remain dominant in terms of the world economic system. As we talked about earlier, the Indian Ocean Basin, the so-called Indian Ocean Basin, was the center of the world economic system prior to the 15th century. So it's going back in that direction, not without difficulties, not without contradictions. But the U.S. is very, very concerned and frustrated about how China has been developing. Russia, the fact that they've been able to survive the most draconian sanctions that exist anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
Same situation with Cuba and Venezuela. They've been under attack for years, yet they have not totally collapsed. So this is a major problem as far as the Trump administration is concerned, and that's why they're taking such an aggressive posture towards Iran and the whole West Asia region. But I don't think it's
well, actually, hold that thought because I do have a question about about all the stuff that you just mentioned. But before we go into that a little deeper, Mozambique is currently governed again by Frelemmo's Daniel Chapo since January the 15th, 2005. How do you assess his time in office so far?
Well, because of the fragmentation of the political system there were objections in regard to whether or not the elections were free and fair. Frelimo has remained dominant politically. We're talking about 51 years, it will be in June, since national independence.
Oh, wow. That's almost like the African version of the LDP in Japan.
Okay. Yeah, so
the dominant right-wing party.
There was unrest last year after the elections in Mozambique when Daniel Chapo came to power for Frelimo. There were demonstrations. Some of them were violent, but they were able to put them down, the Frelimo government. So yes, we can expect these type of outbreaks. We had the MNR, for example, during the late 1970s, all through the 1980s and early 90s. There's been outbreaks periodically, violent outbreaks on the part of MNR against the Frelimo government, but they've all been squashed. So it's not going to be surprising if we see unrest in Mozambique and also in Tanzania. There was disturbances as well over the recent elections that took place. But as far as I can see, there's really no left alternative in Tanzania or in Mozambique. So therefore, in my opinion, Frelimo and the CCM, the Chama cha Mapinduzi, the Revolutionary Party of Tanzania, are still the best options for the Tanzanian and Mozambican masses. I would say the same thing about Zimbabwe. The opposition is right-wing, is supported by the West. So until there's some type of left opposition that is viable and reasonable, I just see these outbreaks as being more or less destabilization operations coordinated by the West, supported by the West, and led largely by opportunists. And that's what we've seen in Mozambique as well.
And well, you already sort of answered this question. Well, you already sort of answered this question about Mozambique's relations with the USSR, Cuba, and the Eastern Communist ones. So I'm not going to ask that again. And apparently, you mentioned that they also had a good relations with China. So let me ask
Yes,
this.
very good. More so with China than the Soviet Union, actually.
That is in, that is
Yeah,
interesting because I'm definitely on the Soviet side when it comes to the Sino-Soviet split. so
yeah,
that so
right. But
so
interestingly
so
enough,
and let me ask this question
yeah.
then, which is, what is Mozambique's relations, if it has any, with BRICS collectively, or certain members of BRICS? And then my follow up question is, what has been Mozambique's response to the African Spring, the anti-French wave that has rocked West Africa, the Sahel, and yeah, curious response.
Well, the African Union does have observers in all the BRICS summits. Some of the countries have joined. Of course, South Africa was the first, and then countries like Egypt and Ethiopia now are members as well. And I'm sure others will be joining the fold. So they would not be hostile to BRICS and are probably interested in joining. They have very good relations with Brazil as well, because they have a common
Language.
ancestral
Yeah.
colonial legacy. Portugal, controlled Brazil all the way up until like 1810, the early 1800s, and then after that, there was a Portuguese monarchy that existed all the way up to the late 1880s, and it was a mass uprising in Brazil in 1888 that actually brought about the collapse of slavery. Brazil and Cuba were the last countries where the Atlantic slave trade and chattel slavery were outlawed. So
Interesting.
they have very good relations with Brazil, the Mozambicans. So they import a lot of clothing and other products from Brazil, as well as from the People's Republic of China. But yeah, China was very, very strong in terms of their support for Frelimo, even during the armed struggle and after the armed struggle. So in that sense, I think eventually they will move into the BRICS Plus summit. And you
Interesting.
asked another question too.
Yes. What's Mozambique's response been to the African Spring, the anti-French wave, and also Mozambique? I've actually completely forgot to have asked this question on the several other African countries we've covered. But what's Mozambique's response to AFRICOM? Is it for or against it? Very curious.
No, they would definitely be against it. Hasn't been any assistance from them in terms of dealing with these rebel groups in Cabo Delgado or other problems they've had internally. AFRICOM right now is in a very precarious situation because of the anti-French sentiment that exists largely in West Africa and Central Africa.
Yes.
But at the same time, Trump is reconfiguring U.S. relations with Africa. For example, he scrapped the AGOA. Then he signed an agreement saying that it could continue for a short period of time. Also, assistance in terms of the Agency for International Development. All of its problems, all of its efforts to manipulate the internal politics in Africa, they did provide medicines and vaccines and other assistance to the African countries. But at the same time, we have to look at the overall crisis of imperialism and the fact that Mozambique fell into a serious debt problem during the 20th century. At one point, they even declared themselves to be in default in regard to their financial obligations. This was around close to a decade ago. So there is restructuring ongoing in Mozambique. But in terms of the anti-French sentiment, I'm not sure, but I think that because France really did not have a base in that part of Africa, uh, it was largely the British in Tanzania and in Kenya and in Zambia and Zimbabwe. But the Portuguese were the main culprits as far as Mozambique was concerned. And today, Portuguese, their economy is not doing that well either. So, in terms of the French anti-French sentiment, which exists in other parts of Africa, I don't see them playing a role in that or having much to say about it, other than promoting, greater genuine independence and sovereignty for all of Africa.
You already sort of answered the question I'm about to ask, but I'm still gonna ask it. This is my second to last question. So Mozambique, like Zambia, Tanzania, Ghana, and other African countries, whether they were social democrats to Marxist dictatorships or even far right ones who wanted to be more populist with the vast working class, working poor, and destitute poor, made terrible mistakes in doing what the IMF and the World Bank wants. And are you surprised that these Marxist Leninists, African scientific socialists, could make crucial mistakes in accepting these predatory loans from rackets like the IMF and World Bank? Why or why not? Very curious your response.
Well, I don't know what other choice they had during that time period. It was very limited credit available from the Soviet Union, particularly after the ascendancy of Mikhail Gorbachev, even Cuba, which was a staunch ally of the USSR. Their aid programs were cut as well, and they went more towards cooperation with China, which sent bicycles and other forms of assistance to Cuba. So, yes, it's a very bad situation in terms of the extension of credit. And Mozambique, they wound up being in extensive amounts of debt, some of it which was concealed from the general public. And there's been scandals surrounding that, corruption trials related to the debt problem. But right now they're trying to restructure their debt. But it's all over Africa. Zambia is another case in point. Egypt, Ethiopia, they're all facing financial problems because Africa is still heavily integrated, for use of a better term, into the world capitalist system. And it's a very vicious system, and it only benefits the Western industrialized states. So, yes, it was a bad situation, but what choice did they have? There were some positive benefits to it, that they created higher incomes and more jobs for working class people. But no, in the long term, it's no solution because all it's going to do is wind up creating more debt, which the working people and poor people have to pay. Same situation in Kenya, which has never have said, Kenya never said that they were socialists or mixed economy or anything like that. But they have serious external debt problems as well. We saw what happened last year when they had to raise taxes in order to pay international debt, and the youth rose up in rebellion in Kenya, which resulted in a lot of deaths among ordinary people and youth. So Africa is still facing the question of neocolonialism and how to deal with it.
And that's a perfect segue to my final question, which is the following. I always love asking this question, which is the following. So Mozambique, like all of Africa, especially when we look at the Horn, the West, East, Central, Southern Africa, the island nations, is still plagued with horrendous poverty, people living in absolute squalor and destitution. And even when far left or left-leaning, even when far left or left-leaning governments were in power, however, is the answer to the plight of the majority poor and those who are what we call in-work poverty, or the tiny precarious middle class, the answer to all of this is still radical socialism, despite whatever mistakes left-wing or left-leaning governments have made in the past, absent of Western sabotage.
Yeah, I agree. And I think Falimo would agree as well that there needs to be more regional and continental unity, and inevitably, socialism will be the answer. I also wanted to mention that several natural disasters have taken place in Mozambique and other countries in Southern Africa, Malawi, even parts of South Africa and Zimbabwe. These cyclones, which have hit, have been a major problem in setting the country back in terms of agricultural production and also commercial services. And industrial development as well, because a lot of things have been destroyed, with these cyclones and these floods. So that's a major factor that people have to take into consideration when they evaluate the socioeconomic status of the people in Mozambique.
Well, that's a perfect place to end. Well, we were joined on this edition of One Plus One with our wonderful tour guide, historical guide, and teacher, Abayomi Azikiwe of Pan African Newswire and Black Agenda Report. Folks, subscribe to both outlets. Get Abayomi's books, which you can find also at Pan African Newswire, and donate to Black Agenda Report generously. And again, share widely all of One Plus One's content and check out our entire Africa series so far at our playlist, which I'll post below. Donate to One Plus One, and don't forget to become a Patreon to my colleague Chris, who is struggling with unemployment. You can give up at least Spotify to become a Patreon. This is because all of the free music is on YouTube anyways, and drop at least Amazon Prime and Disney Plus and HBO Max to become a Patreon to Chris. It'll be money well spent. Next week, wow, the country we will explore is the highly polarizing country of Zimbabwe and the legacy of Robert Mugabe. And no doubt it's going to be one of our more controversial episodes or controversial episodes, depending on your point of view. Join us for that. And then the week after that, if possible, I'm going to try to moderate a debate between an anti-Mugabe leftist voice and Abayomi, if it's possible. And if it's not possible, then the week after, we'll be covering the history and current affairs of Botswana. So best of luck until then, folks. Have a great weekend. And rest in peace to the actor who played Xander in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and rest in peace to Asha Bosle. Even if one is not a fan of Bollywood, one is definitely a fan of her body of music work and the inspiration behind the song Brimful of Asha in the 45, which the wonderful Fatboy Slim Norman Cook remix. All my best, folks. Good night and good luck, and all my best until then.